Yeah, welcome to our latest debate on Black Lives Matters and various other subjects that we've been talking about over the past 3 programs. Today we've got a guest, Philip, who's a friend of Jerome's. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
And we're going to continue on our theme from the previous discussion where we didn't have enough time. And the first topic that we're going to talk about is reverse racism and whether it is at all possible for people of color to be racist towards the majority, I guess, white population that we're surrounded with. So we'll finish off, if we have enough time, on the subject about defunding the police. And I know Jerome has very passionate views on this one, so we'll see what everybody else thinks about it as we go along. So without further ado, we can start off with, actually, let's start off with our guest then and get him in nice and early. So yeah, Philip, over to you, my friend.
How do you guys usually start this? Just my general opinion on reverse.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a big fixation on the word racism. Technically, whatever the Oxford Dictionary definition is, then by that, of course, Black people or ethnic minorities could be racist to white people. I don't know if you leave them out. If I'm just trying to think of like a very basic example in which you could technically be racist, but I think when most people discuss it, and probably in the context of this discussion, we mean that, can you be systemically racist? Like, is it even possible to be racist and when you are not the dominating race? So yes, by like dictionary definition, of course you can, and you get all of these people on Twitter like, oh, that's reverse racism, but I think they're purposefully looking at it in like a narrow lens, and they're not looking at it in the wider context of systemic racism. So that's my basic take on it.
Michael, over to you.
Yeah, so if we're following on from what Philip was saying, I think anyone can be racist to anybody. You know, thinking about the definition, you know, it's based on discrimination, prejudice, X, Y, and Z, with the notional idea that you're more superior to the other race. Thinking about going back to the systemic sort of idea, it comes down to those who own the system. But I think at the base of it all, it comes down to being a noble human being, being an ambassador, and living a life of integrity. So if there's something that you don't want happening to other people, then by that same notion, you shouldn't be able to do it back to them, even if you are the minority or not. So it's about having that same level of intention, integrity, X, Y, and Z. In terms of a bigger sense, from a Western ideology, from a Western standpoint, of course we are the minority. Globally though, we destroy, you know, the other race in that sense. So again, it comes down to context, what society you're in, but also, you know, if we're focusing on dictionary definitions, yes, anyone can be racist, but do we just stop at that dictionary definition, or do we sort of say, okay, there are nuances and caveats? I think if you want to stick to integrity, then you stick to integrity, and that's it. You don't try to add anything else.
Okay, Jeremy, I think your turn.
Sure, yeah. So I think what the other two guys have said is definitely true. I think it's very important to say what you mean by racism. For me, I think when you compare it to any other thing of top form of oppression, so homophobia or whatever else, it's just discriminating based on somebody based on their race. So I think, yeah, 100% sure you can do that. And I also think we'd always make it a black-white thing, but it could be, you know, black to Asians or whatever else, Asians to black, whatever race to any other race, essentially, based on the color of their skin. So I think that's definitely for sure. When we look at it in terms of systematic, I think it depends also what you mean by systems. Like, your system could be your school, your system could be your particular job, and those systems will vary. So I know we can talk about systems in terms of like government and the governing bodies of those countries, but if I look at a workplace and I know that there's an affirmative action scheme there, or I look at a particular university, I know there's an A to B scheme there for Black people. That's a system I can focus on. In that case, I can play different dynamics. So it depends what system, but I think obviously I appreciate that overall it's easier to oppress somebody with racism, but I don't think that's racism in and of itself.
Okay. What about you, Louise?
Yeah, I think I used to think that reverse racism was a bit of an iffy one, but I definitely do think now that, yeah, anyone can be racist to anyone. And I do think it depends on what society you live. So say if you live in an African country with predominantly Black people, they're going to look at a white person there and think like that person's so different to me. Or like my cousins have had examples where they've had names shouted at them because they've got lighter skin or something like that. So I think it definitely depends where you are. And yeah, I agree with Jeremy. We can't just like look at it black on black. There's white on white racism. Think about Jews and how they were discriminated against for their race. So I think, yeah, we've just got to look at it in terms of the wider context of not just black and white, but everyone as well.
Okay. Jerome?
Yeah, I think kind of to take it back to what Phil said about how you can keep it to the Oxford Dictionary definition and kind of saying I don't necessarily buy into the idea that it would be intentional because of how they kind of go there rather than acknowledging the systemic aspect of it. Because I think sometimes if, you're not inclined to think in that way, then that would be the natural thing for you to do. You're naturally going to go to this definition. And I think that one of the problems that we have in like the current kind of debate is that we fail to actually like kind of proactively define these words so that everybody in the conversation knows like how it's being defined, because sometimes that's why you get these conversations occurring, like you get the breakdown of conversation, because someone will go that's racist, someone will go that's not, and it's not because they don't agree on the kind of injustices of the situation, it's because they don't understand that their definition is different to the definition that they're arguing against. And that, I think that's where, if we're going to have these discussions in like a kind of broader perspective, we have to start making the effort to define those words. Now, I think if you want to go down the route of systemic oppression based on, minorities and majorities, then, it's kind of like, well, what if you have a Black-owned company with, white people then starting to kind of work within it? Are those white people then going to be systemically oppressed if you find that they're not getting the jobs at the right proportion? It kind of, it doesn't really kind of carry on. Now, obviously, there was 100% systemic oppression when there were laws that were being enacted to suppress Black people, but, and that was systemically racist. I think now what we have is, preconceptions that are not necessarily due to racism, which is a complex of inferiority, but down to ignorance, which is more of a misunderstanding and a kind of like a lack of knowledge. And I think, a lot of that has to do with, why, a Black person can walk in, maybe not dressed in the way that everyone else walks in. And even though culturally they're very similar to you, you make those preconceptions and they don't get a job that they should do because they're perfectly capable of it. And I think sometimes that can manifest itself in outcomes that can easily be defined as systemic racism. And it kind of misses little nuances that I think we need to have discussions about. Like for me, I think in 2020, racism is actually less common than ever. I think there's a very small people who are truly, truly racist and think in terms of inferiority compared to, years and years ago. And they're not a powerful majority, and they're actually socially kind of ostracized, which is why, you get 200 people turn up outside the BLM protest and they get looked at as fucking dickheads, this, that, and the other. And yet on social media, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're coming against white people for just making a statement that all lives matter, we get to say all sorts of things about you. And I find it difficult and sort of disingenuous to kind of go, well, we can't be racist as a defense against that. So,
can I ask you all what your opinions are on the Black Entertainment TV channel, and whether you feel that in any way at all, if that's some form of sort of reverse racism? Because to my mind, it always strikes me as being a bit strange that you can have a an organization which obviously predominantly caters for the needs of one indigenous, you know, race of people. So, you know, do any of you think that that's a form of reverse racism, or is that just something that is probably necessary in order to, you know, sort of redress some kind of imbalance within the media?
So I was going to say, I think obviously, you know, in some people's minds there's a fine line, but I don't think the intention is to be, you know, reverse racism in that sense. And I think as Jerome is saying, we need to be very clear about definitions of racism. And so it comes down to, it's an ideology, really. It's the idea that my race is more superior to the others, or the other race is inferior. Now, I think someone said before how, you know, sometimes it's down to ignorance or education, X, Y, and Z, but it's still the ideology nonetheless. I think there is a fine line, because you sometimes get, you know, Black, proud, powerful individuals saying, I'm Black, I'm bold, I'm beautiful. Black people have this energy about them, and, you know, we get all empowered and we all feel it and all this kind of stuff. But there's a question mark against those other races. Like, so are they not, you know, powerful in that sense as well? And some would argue, no, they're not, because the energy that resonates. But then how do you quantify that, really? And so I think what I'm trying to say is, maybe expressively it may come across that way, but the intention is not that way as well. Because if you're coming down to sort of a microcosmic sort of point of view in terms of the workplace, X, Y, and Z, we're always talking about how, you know, there's lack of opportunities. We don't see enough people who look like us, X, Y, and Z. I think this is just their attempt of getting representation, okay? That there is a heavy sort of focus on entertainment and people within media focus and creative industries. However, it's a form of representation, and I think that's what it's aiming to do.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that?
Phil?
Yeah, I think I definitely understand your point, your question. But I think what it does, and I understand what Michael was saying as well. So for me, if you can say that Black people don't have a certain opportunity, but they have a lot to add in terms of value. So for example, hip hop, right? Then you might want to say we deserve and should celebrate hip hop. It's kind of like Carnival as well. So we've got all this beautiful culture. We want to show it on the biggest stage because it's that level that everything else on the global stage has. And so you might have those avenues. But in 2020, let's say, or in today's society or whatever, if you say, oh, the Oscars are white, and so you've got people like Will Smith and etc. whatever saying we're not gonna go because there's not enough Black representation. But in the same vein, you've got the BET Awards. It's almost like, well, we are now actually making the Oscars or whatever white. We're actually making the BET Awards only Black because we're saying this is always going to be white, so this is always going to be Black, and you're actually creating the segregation there. But then you also have someone like Justin Timberlake coming to the BET Awards, which for me just shows you're not really celebrating Blackness, you're celebrating Black culture, which has now just transpired to a wider thing of hip hop and soul music and all that sort of stuff. So why not bring that and through its own merit, force that into the mainstream VMAs, all this sort of stuff, and maybe have a hip hop category, which by nature will have more Black people in it, but eventually won't be about race necessarily. It will just be celebrating good culture that we enjoy. So I think it is unnecessarily divisive. And when it's not imposed by the other side, you're imposing the division yourself by making a separate thing, I think.
I can also add to that as well. The National Museum of African.
Hold on. Can we just, Phil, what do you think? Sorry.
Why? Well, no, I was just going to say, I guess I always try and look at things from like an empathetic lens, and the only category that I sit in, there's a few categories that I sit in which in which I'm not oppressed. So by that I mean I'm a man. So you have Women's March, you have Pride, you have all these things which I'm completely for and agree. And for some reason, I feel like there's always a negative lens whenever Black people put Black on it. So like, because you can have Women's March and everyone's like, yeah, like I'm for that, or you can have Pride, and you always get the idiots who are like, oh, why can't we have Men's March, or why can't we have the straight march? So I always question why is it when black people, whenever they put their label on something, then that's when everyone always wants to jump in and be like, whoa, 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 that's not fair. Why do you have your own thing? Why can't we have ours? I always feel like there's an intense focus whenever we do it. But if somebody said the same thing, yeah, I mean, I should, it's always difficult to compare and contrast different struggles, and it's not like for like, but yeah, that was what was on my mind.
But would you say that do you think that women have their marches without any sort of question and any sort of opposition? And
no, they do. Yeah, they do. They definitely do.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think it's because I think when you think about it like that, I think the BLM to begin with was I mean, this is probably the first time I'd say it was like universally kind of just agreed with. Like everyone was kind of for it. Like there was a lot of, you know, it kind of ostracized itself as it became more and more extreme with the demands it was making, and as like certain types of behaviour were kind of being displayed, whether or not kind of, you know, accurately reported, or like you can make questions as to how the media influenced that. But I think to begin with, you know, you know, I mean, especially in my circle, I think we were seeing a lot of, you know, whether it was real or not, let's talk about the whole black square thing. You know, we can talk about kind of how virtue signaling that was, but I think I don't think the black one was met with that much resistance to begin with. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't necessarily think in the context of BLM 2020. For some reason, when everything kicked off this year, it seems to have gone all the way through culture, and people are listening. Like even at work, like an organization like mine, they're doing things, and my mind is blown that like people are even beginning to have these conversations. So yeah, I don't think necessarily just. I'm not saying it's just in this year that people have raised opposition to it. I feel like it's just been a constant thing, but maybe that's just because of my own perspective as a black man, and I'm not necessarily part of the LGBT community, so I don't know kind of what backlash they get, or as a woman. So yeah, I can only give it from my perspective.
Yeah,
I guess.
Okay, Louise?
No, I think because the BT, correct me if I'm wrong, was made in the 80s. I think at the time it was made, it was quite necessary for black people to have a voice in the entertainment industry, because they were thriving so much and they were making all this amazing music that was being celebrated by everyone, but they weren't recognised for that. And I think BT was really important to showcase that. And I mean, didn't it make the first black billionaire? Like a lot of firsts were made from that network. So I think, yeah, it's a really good opportunity for people. I don't think it's reverse racism. I think it's just a celebration of black culture, if I'm being honest.
I think that's Madam T.J. Walker, first black billionaire, long time ago.
Yeah, but although you don't see black as being a predominant you know, name within the title, the logo of the company, and why was it necessary for it to be called Black Entertainment Television anyway? Why couldn't it have just been called, you know, entertainment for whatever? And you know,
to make a statement, obviously. To make a statement, you know, we're here. That's it, you know, we're here. And that's how people felt back then, at least when it was started in the inception of it. And I think that's what all of this does. Like, whether you're looking at black or other sort of groups, the emphasis is on, I want to say, popularized minorities. And I say that because there are so many different types of groups of minorities that are not even spoken about, but these are the ones that are spoken about, so to speak. And so I think if you look at the UK, if you look at the US, if you look at all of these different places, although there are a lot of black individuals who feel sort of like marginalized or feel uncomfortable around groups in the workspace, whether stuff has happened to them or not, just for the fact that there are other people around them. I still feel like in a metropolitan like London, X, Y, and Z, the majority race kind of forgets themselves, sometimes at least, that they are the majority because of the spread and the mix of what they see in the vibrance of a city or whatever it is. And so with that in mind, they may not think of it as a minority when it comes to a black individual, when it really is, you know, like 4% of the population is attributed to black individuals, 3 to 4%, 8% plus again to Asians, X, Y, and Z. The majority, white British at least, is about 75, 80% of this population. So they do rule the roost, but in those sort of like the media doesn't necessarily portray it that way in that sense. And I always come back to this. How you define things, how you say things, and what you see is so important for the psyche in terms of how we respond to stuff. And the media has been a big part. And when I say the media, I mean the news specifically has been a big part of how we shape the way we think as well. And obviously social media has come into that, but that comes down to your initial sort of preferences or activity, X, Y, and Z.
Okay, go on, Jn'L.
Cool. So the kind of slight issue I have with, if we talk about white as the majority and then any other minorities, but obviously specifically we're talking about black people, is that I think when you have the minority, whether it's black people or maybe sort of Asian families or Jewish families, let's say in Europe and stuff like that, they tend to work together. There tends to be a family ethos over whether that's sort of more strict rules, whether that's religions or subcultures, whatever. Like, we do this, we go to these schools, we eat these foods, whatever. We work together to lift each other up. So there's that kind of sense of working together. So what it means to be black is a little bit more defined. But I feel like when you're the majority in a country and you've got all these nuances, like we were saying earlier about, like I say, like being Jewish or Irish or Italian or this part of the country, that part of the country, doesn't necessarily mean just because they're all white politically, doesn't necessarily mean they work in that larger system. Because if they see themselves in a smaller subset, doesn't mean they even have their kind of put themselves in the other systems that would be there for all white people. So it doesn't mean they operate with this power of like 75%. It might mean they might see themselves as Irish, which means they only ever eat and do whatever else that other Irish people do. And so they are kind of operating in the same sort of minority that a black person would be. Do you see what I mean? And like, there's so many, being white is such a broad term because of the culture of this country, let's say, as well, and all the different people that invaded the country and the history there. So I get that being white passing has its own privilege or whatever you want to call it, instead of people not being overtly racist to you based on the color of your skin. But in terms of the way they actually live their life, they don't necessarily live it, even in their own perception of themselves, through this kind of majority superiority privilege. You know what I mean? They might see themselves as whatever.
I don't think I was talking about privilege or anything like that.
No, not you. Just
I know. Just wanted to clarify though. It was more a sense of perception. It's almost like when you see someone you like it's in what I've just said. I've seen them.
Yeah.
But I know nothing about them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's what it comes down to a lot of the time. You don't really know about that other person, because to say you don't know about that race is making an assumption in itself, if that makes sense. But no, I know you're not saying it about me, but I just wanted to clarify even that point.
Definitely, yeah.
And it's one. I think it's a topic, quite honestly, that it's quite difficult to really to sort of, I don't know, almost pigeonhole or talk about, because if you're a minority group, how can you be how can you be racist against somebody that's the majority? I mean, I can't understand that. I can understand it perhaps within minorities, that there might be, or for instance, there's this notion that Indian people tend to recruit within themselves, or surround themselves with people like-minded at the extent of anybody else. So I don't know. I mean, I
just think that we operate in small systems. I don't think it is this like massive system of we're all England and everyone goes to the same. It's this white versus black. I mean, if I live in a local area where everyone in my local football team are black, and that team doesn't want any white people playing with them, my specific experience of being white and wanting to play in that football team is affecting my system. It doesn't matter what the statistics are for the rest of the country or another country in US or whatever. That's my system. So I don't think anything you ever do in life necessarily, apart from some like government policies and laws, which, as we've already discussed, have kind of universally been kind of equal. No one lives under the rules of the whole country. If you live in your own little town, there's always a different set of rules for your little town. And so if you're in Birmingham, white's a minority in Birmingham, second biggest city in the UK. So you might be a white kid, only white kid in your year. You might be the only Christian kid in your year. And so you might not understand what it means to be sort of Asian and what it means to be Muslim, whatever else. And you need to acclimatize to all maybe different languages, different cultures and stuff like that. Now, and they might have perceptions about your culture being British, even though they're living in England. They might have some prejudice. Oh, he's English. He doesn't have good food, or we're not going to go around his house, or whatever. Even if it seems a little thing, it's harsh for them. But you know what I mean? Just because England as a whole has that experience doesn't mean these small pockets of racism can't exist in England and the US.
Yeah.
Jerome, maybe come back to us. Yeah.
So no, so basically kind of the point I was making is when we actually look at how white people within kind of urban areas obviously spend a lot more time hanging around, like Jeremy said, you can be the only white person in your class in certain places in urbanized areas as compared to rural areas where it's more white. But then what you actually see is attitudes from those people within the urban areas, especially when you actually add in the urbanization usually correlates with more education in some examples, is that they look at these people on the outskirts with like a lot of vitriol. They kind of say, oh, you know, these are the racist people. You get the Brexit, anti-Brexit, you know, which to me seems as a kind of more a cultural thing. And it kind of brings into the notion that like, you know, a lot of this is cross-contaminated of cultural aspects and racial aspects, and having the color of your skin and correlate with some sort of culture is sometimes where we make we identify things as racism rather than sometimes it's just could be things like xenophobia, where you actually like you're not liking certain aspects of a culture. I think it needs to be, it manifests itself in the same outcome and people feeling the same way and feeling ostracized in the same way, but sometimes it's not necessarily that. And you know, that's why I think that the racism and the inferiority aspect of it is quite an important feature, because then you can start to realize that, you know, there are blacks that see themselves as superior depending on where they come from. So like in Africa, in the Middle East, you know, you have class systems in the Middle East that's purely based on the perceptions of inferiority and superiority. So, you know, it's the idea that being a minority somewhere means you can't be racist kind of doesn't make sense to me, because I'm telling you, there's Saudi princes walking around London right now, you know, who are not the right color. They are the minority, and they are not looking at anybody like they're inferior to anyone. So if you're a Nigerian prince and you get off a plane, you come to London, you got more money than anyone else here, you ain't feeling inferior to no one, and anyone talks to you, probably doesn't matter what color you are, you're gonna feel superior to them. So I think we need to, you know, it's you know, kind of bring it back to foot. We just need to be honest about, you know, what we're going to actually take into account from the idea of what racism is to kind of define it, but rather than just, you know, it seems to me sometimes it's a lot of the time it's used as an excuse to kind of just, but then portray the same behavior that you're having done onto you, which is kind of what Michael was alluding to at the beginning. It's like, do unto others as you would have done to yourself. So, but yeah, that was a point I was going to make.
Okay. Unless anybody else got anything else that they want to add, I think we want to move on to the topic of defunding of police. And as I said earlier on, I know it's a topic that's Jerome is very passionate about. So I think we'll kickstart with him and whether he thinks all this hullabaloo in the US about, you know, whether funding's taken away from the police force and then they start all over again with a different way of you know, looking after, you know, well, basically just looking after their people is the way forward or not. So, Jerome, give me your opinion on it, please.
I think the problem from the very beginning, like the UK has kind of seemed to adopt a lot of the American kind of issues, and we kind of then jump onto their slogans without really, and then are forced to then decontextualize them in order for people to actually understand what people are getting at. Now, like the idea of defunding the police in America, I mean, if you're going to look at what's going on now, you know, even considering doing that and actually making points into doing that, the murders have gone sky high. So, you know, I just think we really need to be sensible about like what the outcomes are going to be. I think we defund the police. Sorry.
No, I was just going to quickly ask, can I ask what your definition of defunding the police is?
Yeah,
So, I mean, so taking, I mean, defunding the police, taking money away from police departments. Yeah. Now, honest, as a marketing perspective, the idea of defunding the police, and we need to be like serious about when you're saying these things and you want movements to build up. Yeah. It's easy for people who are on your side and who also have the same kind of feelings of injustice as you to kind of go, well, oh, I'm going to take him with a pinch of salt and I'm going to assume he means well. But when you're talking to people who don't assume that naturally, you need to understand that the way it's perceived is important. and the messages is important. And when you say defund the police, I'm going to take you for your word. You're just kind of take money away from the police. Now, if you do that, you know, you're going to get more deaths. Now, I recognize, and, you know, I'm not silly enough to kind of ignore all the kind of people who come on and said what defunding the police actually is. But, you know, if we go for a UK, and I think that, you know, there's a lot of arguments to be made that the police are kind of overfunded in certain areas and underfunded in others. I think a lot of the police is actually the unions that allow them to protect themselves when things go wrong is definitely something that we should kind of take away from. I think, but in the UK, you know, we defunded the police. Theresa May defunded the police. She took many police off the streets. Yeah, and as a result, you've got less people walking around building relationships within communities, and you developed an increase in levels of mistrust. You know, and I think, you know, that's not a good thing. Yeah. What she also did at the same time is she started to defund other departments that were involved in kind of like child sexual exploitation, child crime exploitation, all these departments that are involved in trying to get into communities and prevent things before children become, you know, the criminals who eventually end up in jail, and perpetuating these stereotypes that end up having them stopped and searched on the street. You know, and I think, you know, we're sending a message that the people who are supposed to be there to protect us are initially our enemies. And I think the biggest issue I've had is, you know, it's, yes, there are good ideas within the idea of defund the police, but the way that people are promoting these ideas is by giving examples of how these police are bad, how these police do this, this and this. And a lot of these videos are interactions between two people, one of whom has a chip on their shoulder because, you know, they've been taught that not to trust the police, and they respond in a certain way. And then the police, it all escalates because poorly trained, or like they come across the wrong guy, and it turns into a situation that we then see on the social media side. And what I don't like is when you then talk to these people who are more educated, who are more politicized, who understand the consequences of that sort of stuff. What do you do when you see a police? And they say, well, I say, yes, sir, no, sir. And I'm compliant because I understand that, you know, that there's, you know, it can go wrong. And I'm like, well, if you're going to do that, then that should be the messaging that you're pushing forward. Yeah, you can still come with the message of police are bad, and the policing needs to be changed. But if you're teaching people who are less educated, like less rational than yourself, that the police are bad, and that's the message stops there, the way they respond is going to result in more and more of this stuff happening. I think that's the issue that I have right now is you know, we need to be really careful about our messaging, because social media is exactly that. It's social, and you can't control who's watching your videos. And, you know, when it gets pushed out with no kind of like actual journalism done, you know, we get more people reacting in ways, you know, and now you get kind of what was the athlete who got followed and then she got taken out of her car. And kind of, when you break down that situation, you know, she was getting followed by the police. Yeah, the guy refused to stop when he tried to pull her over for like 3 or 4 corners. Then they eventually cornered her and pulled him out. He had tinted windows, which is why they were following him. Yeah, so they didn't realize, they couldn't have known he was black before they pulled him out of the car. Yeah, and then once they did pull him out of the car, it was because he refused to stop. Now, is that because they were racist? No, it was because of the things building up to that. But a perception of the police being bad kind of, I believe, helps kind of push that kind of narrative into your head and actually make you mistrusting, and it makes you more resistant to things that could have just gone a lot easier.
All right, Michael.
So I think with that situation, I hear what you're saying, Jerome. I think they could have handled it slightly better. But I think, you know, I don't know the numbers. I'm a numbers guy. I like to look at the qualitative information, X, Y, and Z. In terms of defunding the police, I'm going basically with what the word says. So defund, remove money or reallocate to whatever. And I think within the UK, what's happened is there has been a decline in the amount of money that's been put towards social services type of stuff, you know, things that really sort of like help the community and all that kind of stuff. So I think there are things that need to support the police to do their job more effectively, maybe not directly, but indirectly. Now, do I think the police need to be defunded? No, not necessarily, but there needs to be a different approach, maybe in terms of leadership and or I know we always talk about training, but what does that really mean? Because it's not necessarily training in a sense of, you know, something you do online and that's it, or something you do once. There's something about regularity. There's something about practice. There's something about being better equipped for different situations, but you're not always going to cover everything. And so in society in general, we focus on the negatives as opposed to the positives. I'm more likely going to know more about the negatives if I don't do any research than I do know about the positives. It's like when you go onto Amazon and you're trying to find something, and you find something, you go through all of the reviews just to try and find a bad review. It's almost like we want to find a bad review to be like, no, I don't like it. This person said it's terrible. And so with that in mind, it's like, if we don't have that information, or if we don't look at things from an objective and more sort of strategic lens, then we're going to say things like defund the police when we don't necessarily know what that may mean for us. Again, it's looking at those examples, it's looking at those qualitative examples and the hard facts as well, to then decide, does it make sense to do that across the land, or in these areas, that areas X, Y, and Z? What we do know is that, police are more heavily sort of like, what's the word, around in places where inequalities are quite high. And so there's going to be a high rate of particular races who are going to be picked up by by the police, based on the fact that, they're part of that inequality majority in that sense. So looking at the numbers and dissecting it a bit better should help inform those decisions in terms of whether that's a sensible thing or not. Like Jerome was saying, when it comes to the US and the UK, they're not even slightly different. They are different. They have different things that they're dealing with. I think when it comes to the US, or even in general, the problem always comes down to the user, okay? It's always down to the user. It's like when people say social media is bad. No, the user is responsible. However, the second thing is they have guns in the US. So it's a different ball game altogether. I don't even want to get involved in that debate, in that sense. But the US and the UK are different. And so that's how I see things from my standpoint. Look at the numbers, look at what it means in context to our place, and then we can make decisions.
Okay. Bill?
So I agree very much with Jerome in that the marketing message of defund the police isn't the greatest, because the first thing that anyone, I mean, even myself, like, who like sits into in a particular camp, when I first heard defund the police, I was like, okay, what does that mean? I had to go and research and actually look at the definition. So the slogan isn't great, but when you actually look at what they mean, for me anyway, my interpretation is that it's a redistribution of funds. No one's saying that they're going to remove loads of police off the street and everyone's going to go crazy and start murdering each other. It's when it comes to social issues. So if there's a guy who's got mental health problems, it doesn't really make sense that the first person that you call is the police. Probably not as bad in the UK as it is in the US, granted. Like, if there's a guy in the US and he's not all there, like, it's a very high chance it's going to get violent. So yeah, for me, I'm not against defunding the police. I think I disagree with certain things that Jerome was saying. I was trying to remember exactly which bits. I think that mistrust of the police, a lot of that is warranted. So I think you were saying, Jerome, that, like, obviously we know better in my interactions with the police and stuff. I just want to get back to what I'm doing as quickly as possible. So I'm just gonna comply. But I don't think it's fair that we should have that expectation that we should just always comply, because then if that's our default position, then I don't know, for me that's crazy, that, like, we should constantly be questioning the police. I'm not saying that, we should be making their job difficult, but these are people in the US and the UK who have considerable amounts of power. Like, they can like ruin your life, they can end your life. So we should very much scrutinize how they operate, whether they need to get paid more, whether they need better training. Yeah, fine. But the fact that anyone can, or almost anyone can, become a policeman overnight, have power. I mean, I think, Jerome, you saw those videos I was putting on my story where they were stopping and searching guys, and they didn't really have a valid reason, and then the guys were getting more angsty, and then put them in handcuffs and stuff like that. Like, for me, that's infuriating. And for me, it comes from education, but also a lot of policemen in London, like, a lot of them aren't from London. So, like, they're from county cities or even further out, and they come in and they have no understanding of the communities that they deal with. So yeah, I agree with you, the messaging needs to be better. And it's very easy for me to say, yeah, defund the police and blah blah blah, because as soon as I say that and I don't know, a random person from Bournemouth hears me or something like that, they're going to think, what's he on about? Like, there needs to be a better effort at bridging the gap in terms of the definition. But I do think, yeah, I do very much think it's a warranted strategy.
Can I just
Okay, John? Yeah, John, you'll come back
so,
on that.
I mean, the thing is, I agree entirely with what you said. I think the idea of, you know, allocating money to other departments is kind of what I said about, you know, they got rid of, you know, departments. I know people that worked within departments for sexual exploitation, child gangs exploitation, that they, you know, they kind of, the way the government works is they'll think they're doing well with a problem and go, well, the problem's solved now, and they'll take the money back away. And 100%, we need to not be doing that. We need to be allocating the money in those directions. But again, kind of the points you were making, to me, if you're going to pay police more and make it a job that has a higher level of prestige and connects a higher number of good people, then you can't defund the police. And you know, if we, you know, for me, I think if we're, it is a much better kind of way of looking at it would be like, we need to allocate more money away from other things that we're spending stupidly on. Because I think there's just a lot of waste in the NHS in terms of, you know, we've taken money away from the kind of actual direct care. You know, I've got a lot of, you know, people who work like GPs, doctors, people who work on the front line, who have basically said, you know, one of the things they've noticed about a lot of these kind of middle management, which is a kind of generalization and a level of ignorance, I say, is people who weren't actually there because they were at home, you know, working from home. They found everything just ran so much smoother because they were able to make decisions for themselves more autonomously. And to them, what they were highlighting was there is so many people doing jobs that are not necessary, they're not needed. And that, you know, of course, that's not going to encompass the whole departments of middle management. There are people, you know, across all bands of, I think, public services, you do have a lot of people, you know, earning higher than kind of the median income, you know, doing jobs that, you know, other people could do, you know, younger people coming through, higher educated people do. You pay less of them more money, you know, and start allocating it towards social issues so that we can say, right, you know, that's, and it's like refunding things from elsewhere and actually putting more money into the police and other areas around it. And I think a lot more people would be like, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because you can't say defund the police and then make the argument we need to pay police more, because unless you want less of them, then, you know, it doesn't really make financial sense. But if you go, right, let's take the money away from Trident. Yeah, we don't, you know, a lot of people would argue we don't need Trident. Let's take the money away from that. That's billions and billions of pounds. You know, if we redirect that into, you know, the social policing, kind of like, you know, helping to kind of like push grassroots kind of social, you know, I don't know what word it would be, but that to me would be a much more marketable, sensible, and like, again, like Michael said, I feel like would be much more easy to kind of justify numbers wise. I think, you know, I mean, I'm not going to be able to put any numbers off my head, but I just think it makes much more sense. And again, it's not even me disagreeing with what you said. It's just kind of the actual notion just kind of is counterintuitive when you think about what the actual solutions would be.
Just one point. I need to obviously defend the NHS in that sense. You know, I think the reform happened back in, I think it was 2012 or whatever, where a lot of power went into the GPs, but they needed help from these middle managers, so to speak. And so there's always going to be some sort of a discrepancy in terms of language. So it's almost like now the NHS needs those people who have experience within that clinical field, but also has the savviness of a management sort of person, or somebody who's quite lean with their methodologies, X, Y, and Z. So I definitely do agree with you, but not fully, if that makes sense. I think that's a general thing for a lot of public services in general anyway. But I think it's quite timely, so I'm going to jump off and I'll let you guys continue. No worries, man.
See you later, man.
Right.
Bye.
Jeremy, it's your turn now to give me your...
So quite aptly, actually, I had a NHS or medical analogy to make, and this is obviously quite lined up quite nicely. So for me, as Jeremy was saying, it's quite counterintuitive, the whole idea. And if I take an example of the NHS, right? So if we said loads and loads and loads of people are dying from poorly trained doctors, whether that was in surgery or whatever the situation was, what's the best solution? And they said to defund the NHS because we're paying these people this money and they're not saving anybody's lives. But that for me is inherently flawed, because surely you need to train them better so they're better at their job and they save more lives. And kind of what Phil was saying, I think, yeah, the arguments for defund the police aren't just take the money away. It's about the fact that police aren't properly trained to look after people who are mentally deranged, have certain nuanced drug problems or whatever, doing all the things that they are called for, basically, they're not prepared to or trained to do half of them. But for me, that isn't a case of take the money away from them and then like redistribute the money so that you can avoid these situations. It's basically maybe even redefine some of the police roles or have more nuanced police roles, so that, because people want to be able to call a number. Like most people don't know all the services that are out there for all these different things in life, but they know that 911 when an emergency strikes. So maybe you should have that. The operator should be able to slightly differentiate between teams, so that you do have somebody who has a bit of mental first aid training, or you do have somebody who, you know, whatever the situation, like firemen, for example, they do lots of different things. So I think instead of defunding them, I think we should have more complex training and more divisions within the police system that they can, because they're supposed to basically there to keep up society. They're supposed to, obviously they arrest people, but their job shouldn't only be to arrest people who are, you know, committing violent crimes or doing drugs or whatever. It should be, you know, if an old person falls down the street, you know, they're the ones that pick them up. If there's been an accident or whether they can direct traffic, obviously you have different sections for these things, but I think they're very, very important. Society can run smoothly. And if we, again, back to the NHS thing, if we had a doctor say, look, oh, we've got to cut your leg off, otherwise you'll die. We don't spend time complaining, saying like, oh, but question. We trust, they're a doctor. It's just, I don't want to lose my leg, but I don't want to die, so I'm going to trust them. Same with the police. Okay, they haven't got the same level of training, but if they tell you, for somebody, I have reason to believe that somebody's safety is at risk if you don't do this, that, or the other. It's not for you to question them, because yes, they're just people, but they're people we're having to train to save people's lives, just like doctors or anybody else. So I think more funding needs to go on, and just maybe need to reform what a policeman is. Like they call them the guard in Ireland. I think even just that slight change of language or perception of what a policeman is supposed to do will make all the difference, rather than just taking it away altogether, if that makes sense.
All right, Louise?
Yeah, I agree with Phil in a sense that I didn't know, like people would put it on all over social media, like we need to defund the police, and I was shocked, and I even messaged those people like, what are they talking about, getting rid of money for the police, that we need to put more money into the police. And I had a lot of people come to me with the same examples that Phil was saying about, you know, mental health. If someone's going to jump off a bridge, a policeman shouldn't come with a gun and scare them. A crisis counsellor should come and talk them down. Or in situations like that, we need like more community leaders, rather than, you know, police who have a bad name about them, who have a certain look and will scare people. And, you know, they just, in terms of police, you think like scary, aggressive, like authoritative people, whereas you need people that you can relate to more in certain situations. So I think, yeah, but there are some radical people out there. Like there's a Sigger who was saying that we need to take people out of prisons and do a whole massive reform. And I'm thinking, you know, there are actually bad people out there who deserve, you know, what they've gotten in terms of being arrested or being sentenced. Like, I feel like the whole reformation of the police isn't going to work. I feel like little by little, in different scenarios, you know, thinking more, putting more energy into what is better for a certain situation is what's going to help.
Okay, so if you go, I mean, obviously this whole thing is started because of what's happening in the States. So if we were to just basically concentrate on that, if you've got a police force which is disproportionately you know, treating its community you know, badly, wouldn't it make sense to take away funding from that police force and somehow reform it again, hopefully with more training, or, you know, try and get new recruits who've got maybe a different mindset to how, you know, you deal with people in the community?
I think
is that too difficult a task?
I think going off one of the things Phil said actually, so about people being familiar, like not being in London, like coming from Brighton and suddenly trying to understand what it's like to be in London. I think a positive of the US is their sheriff system, because often the sheriff will be someone like you went to school with, they know your family, they'll come and like have dinner with you, they know the pastors, all, like you have a little kind of community feel. And obviously there's the big cities in the US where they're having all the issues, but when they have those sort of local counties, I think that works quite well, because yeah, you know the sheriff, you know everyone around them, you kind of trust them. So, you know, you might have even killed somebody, but just because you know that sheriff, you're like, look, I've killed them, I don't know what to do, but I trust them that they're going to make sure that I get my day in court or, you know, trustworthy situation because I grew up with them. I know that sheriff since I knew his dad, whatever, right? That kind of sense of community then I think reinforces it so you can get into to trust them a little bit better. I think when it comes to bigger cities and like cities that are always changing in terms of the demographic of people, the dangers, different types of weapons, all that sort of stuff, it's hard to get that sense of like knowing people. I mean, in London, you're not going to meet the same policeman twice, and the policeman's not going to meet arrest the same person twice. So you're not going to be able to establish that rapport. Whereas if there's a bad kid who you've known, you know his parents, you know he's a good kid, he's just acting out, you might be able to develop a relationship with them to be like, look, I know you're a good kid, go home, I'm not going to arrest you this time. Whereas if you've never seen the kid, he could be extremely dangerous. So I think it's hard to have that scale, that approach to a city like London or a city like LA or whatever. And I think that's what's difficult. But you probably need more people for smaller situations. So you need more funding in that sense. That's what I would say about it.
Okay. Anybody else?
Like, I think it also depends on like your perception or what is the desired relationship that you want to have with the police. So for me, I don't have like an inherent trust for the police. For me, I want the police to solve murders. I want them when stuff has been stolen, like for them to retrieve stolen property and things like that. But when it comes to smaller issues, then I don't know, like, so the way that police and like companies in general, the way in which they operate is that everyone has targets. They have quantitative metrics which they need to adhere to, because that's the way in which they are deemed whether they're efficient or not. And so my uncle, he's a policeman with I think it's in Brixton, and he was explaining that they have targets and they have numbers, and they will only go for cases in which there is a high chance of prosecution. So what's an easy way to close a case? Stopping a kid and picking him up with some like marijuana, and that's going to be counted as a case that's closed. That person's committed a crime. But if you go across the pond to California, marijuana is legal, but all of that goes down to what is that metric that they're trying to achieve. So I think, yeah, part of defunding the police is also kind of stepping back and looking at as to what their role should be. And Jeremy, I know you gave that example of like having the community sheriff, but for me, I like when you were describing it, I saw that as negative straight away, because there was that guy in America, I think it was Ahmaud Amari, the guy who got shot with a shotgun when he went for a jog or whatever, and he didn't. After they shot him, they only got arrested 2 months afterwards, because that's when the video came out, and that's because the guy that did it was a former policeman. So obviously he's sorted. He can go and speak to that county sheriff and be like, oh, this is what happened, make up his own lie. So for me, I'm not, and maybe it's my own personal thing, I'm not looking, when I see a policeman, I'm not looking for, oh, hey bud, how are you? How's your kids? I don't want that. I want you to solve murders, and I want you to get my property back, and then I want other people to deal with those social issues.
But the thing is they would either have to be, the police as a department would have to be some sort of overarching thing anyway. So there would have to be some sort of kind of correlation between the two. And I think it's, as Phil said, I think the policing became an issue when it became a numbers game, and it stopped being, because when I've done a lot of like watching videos, seeing police speak and kind of seeing them kind of give their black backgrounds, whether they're black, white, what different areas, and kind of, you get some who, they're just kind of seeing all this and they're like, it's bullshit, they don't really have time for it. And then you've got other people who are like, no, like, I joined the police because my dad joined the police and his dad joined the police. And in a way, it feels a lot like it's almost like joining the army to them. It's kind of like national service, and they do it with a level of pride. And I think, those are sort of people, where they're the guys who, you say you don't want a policeman turning up to stop a guy jumping over a bridge, but they'll be the guys who stand there and actually try and talk him down and talk to him as an individual. We act like we don't ever see videos of police acting with the level of humanity that we've disassociated with them. And we people pull out their cameras to record things that they deem to be wrong. They very rarely catch things that they know to be right. And it's I think we need to recognize that there are human beings out there that are of both sides. And again, the way of finding them is to kind of have a better vetting process 100% feels right. It's ridiculous. You know, it's ridiculous the stat that came out that there are 211 men walking around with things like assault charges and kind of like criminal records, you know, that are then policing our streets, catching people who do drugs and assault people. That makes no sense, you know. And, you know, it's also right that, you know, if you're trying to catch someone for a little bit of drugs because you know that that gives you a good stat and it makes your department look good, you know, I want you kind of talking, I want you kind of going into schools, talking to kids and, you know, trying to encourage them, you know, to be part of protecting your community and keeping them away from drugs and kind of, and actually preventing it from the beginning. So you're not arresting these kids, you're stopping them committing crimes. And kind of to bring back to what Phil said about, I want them solving murders. To me, I want something that prevents murders. I want something that doesn't have these murders occurring. I want murders going down because no one really wants to be doing that shit. They don't feel the need to. And, you know, I think, you know, I get why, Phil, you would say, you know, you don't want to look in police that way. You have a negative view of them. But I think, you know, to some extent, that's a generational thing. And it doesn't have to be that way for the next generation. And I think that we can, you know, we can allow them to look at police in a positive way and in a way that certain areas in America, they look at their police because they don't have the same issues that we do. You know, again, it's all situational, it's all geographical. You know, and some police will walk around, they'll know everyone in their community and they barely ever really do much. They just kind of wear a badge and, you know, solve one crime a year because that's the only crime. But, you know, and I think that part of that is actually kind of recognizing that, yeah, the damage might be done in terms of our generation looking at police in a certain way, but it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to imprint on the next generation and young kids that same kind of dislike and mistrust, you know, and try and kind of, you know, so that they're not having these sort of debates in a few years' time because of the stupid shit that's been going on. And I think, you know, it is, you know, it's important to recognize the injustices now, but I think part of the solution is recognizing that, you know, that, you know, it might not feel as good for everyone, but if it's feeling better for the next generation, then I think that's a much more beneficial situation.
Okay, so is it, I mean, finally, is it safe to say then that despite people shouting about defunding the police, and it's something that's not realistically achievable, and perhaps it's just, you know, just another slogan that sort of, you know, just become accustomed to, but in reality, it's not something that is ever really, you know, going to come to fruition?
I feel like with the current headline slogan, it's very difficult because when you have Keir Starmer, who's like Labour leader, and he like dismissed it as nonsense, then he's meant to be the opposition to Boris Johnson. So from that, like it's kind of a dead point in the UK.
Yeah.
As to some of the aspects within it, I think it's still very possible. So it's never going to be like, oh, in 5 years we defunded the police. Like it's not going to happen in this country. But maybe we can take aspects of it and be like, hey, we. I think as Jeremy was saying, like you can have a number that you can call, and maybe we can reroute certain issues to different services. I feel like aspects of it can be achieved, and maybe that's the whole point in making this demand for an unrealistic objective. Because if you go for it and it's unrealistic, then you'll meet somewhere in the middle. So maybe they know what they're doing. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree as well.
Okay,
Yeah,
good. Yep. I was going to say, yeah, I think what we've done just over a bit of an hour, and I think we're probably going to close this one off. I just want to say thank you to Phil for coming on and
Thank you for inviting me.
And well, I don't know how often we're going to carry on doing this, if we're going to do any more or not, but you know, we'll just have to see how things pan out. And I'll say good night to each and every one of you, and thanks very much for your contribution.
Wow. Cheers.
We're good. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.